They didn't classify Earth as a cradle of life. They classified it as a hazard. The hologram rotated slowly above the council floor, a blue sphere wrapped in storm bands and tectonic scars. Gravity index flashing in red. 1G baseline. Extreme variance zones exceeding standard survivability for most known species. Atmospheric pressure shifts. Microbial density off every known chart. And yet, humans thrive there. Ethan Cole stood beneath that projection, hands folded behind his back, posture relaxed but precise, like he had measured the room down to the inch and decided it wasn't worth more than a glance. His dark jacket unmarked, no rank, no insignia, just a quiet presence in a hall built for beings who measured power in titles and lineage and the way others lowered their eyes when they entered. Lady Veilira did not lower her eyes for anyone. She moved through the chamber like gravity belonged to her. Deep blue skin catching the soft violet light, silver filaments woven through her hair reflecting the rotating stars above. Every step deliberate, every gesture practiced. A noble raised to believe the universe arranged itself around her decisions. When her gaze landed on Ethan, it paused, just long enough to register something unusual. Not threat, not respect, just absence. No reaction. No adjustment, as if her presence did not require acknowledgement. That was new, and she smiled, slow and amused, turning slightly so the entire council could follow her attention. "You brought a human?" she said, voice smooth, carrying easily across the polished floor, the translation field humming softly around her words. A few of the delegates shifted, some curious, others already entertained. As a guard, the word lingered, light, dismissive. Her eyes returned to Ethan, measuring now, sharper. "I was told your kind came from a world that tries to kill you every day." She continued, stepping closer, heels clicking once, twice, the sound crisp in the controlled air. "Tell me, do you survive by luck, or by being very good at following orders?" A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the chamber, subtle, polite, the kind reserved for jokes that carried rank behind them. Ethan didn't move. Not his shoulders, not his hands, not even his eyes. If anything, he seemed to settle deeper into stillness, like a structure built to endure pressure instead of respond to it. Above them, the hologram flickered slightly, recalibrating data streams from the outer systems. A minor glitch no one bothered to acknowledge. No one except him. His gaze shifted, just a fraction, not toward Veilira, not toward the council, but somewhere past them, to a point in space that hadn't been important a second ago. His breathing didn't change. His posture didn't change. But something adjusted. Veilira noticed that. Not the movement itself. There was almost nothing to see. But the absence of reaction to her question, replaced by attention directed elsewhere, as if the conversation had already lost relevance. Her smile thinned. "I asked you something, human." Still nothing. The room held its breath in that subtle way rooms do when power expects a response and doesn't get one. And then, almost imperceptibly, Ethan shifted his weight forward, just 1 inch. Not enough for anyone to call it movement. Not enough for anyone to understand why. Seconds later, the entire balance of the room would change. The council chamber did not notice the shift at first because nothing visible had changed. The air still hummed with controlled temperature at 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The gravity field held steady, and the delegates remained seated in their tiers of polished alloy and glass. But Ethan Cole had already recalculated the room in silence. Every reflection on the mirrored floor, every micro flicker in the overhead projection, every heartbeat within a 30-foot radius mapped without effort. And the anomaly stood out not because it was loud, but because it did not belong. A gap in expected patterns, a presence that moved without drawing attention. And that was what made it dangerous, not fast, not aggressive, just wrong. Lady Veilira tilted her head slightly, studying him now with a hint of irritation rather than amusement, her earlier smile fading as the human continued to deny her the simplest acknowledgement, a response, a glance, anything that confirmed her authority had landed. But Ethan remained focused somewhere beyond her shoulder, and that alone unsettled her more than she cared to admit. "You are either very disciplined," she said, voice quieter now, more precise, "or you are ignoring me." A few delegates shifted in their seats, sensing the subtle change in tone, the difference between performance and curiosity, between a noble making a joke and a noble encountering something she did not immediately understand. Ethan's eyes moved once, just a fraction, tracking something no one else could see, and his hand adjusted at his side by less than an inch, a motion so small it could have been mistaken for nothing at all, except it was deliberate, exact, like a calculation reaching its final value. Across the chamber, a figure stood near the perimeter, partially obscured by a column of refracted light from the hologram above, posture neutral, presence unremarkable, exactly the kind of placement that allowed someone to exist without being noticed. And that was the problem, because everyone in this room was meant to be noticed, every position assigned, every identity logged. And yet this one detail had slipped through every system, every protocol, every expectation, unnoticed by all except the one person who had grown up in a place where missing something meant not going home. Vealara followed his line of sight, but she saw nothing. Only the usual arrangement of delegates and attendants, the soft glow of translation fields, the slow rotation of the planetary display above them. And for a brief moment, she wondered if the human stillness was not defiance but distraction, and that thought irritated her even more. If you cannot answer a simple question, she continued, stepping one pace closer, closing the distance to less than 6 feet, then perhaps you are not suited to stand in a room like this. The words were meant to reassert control, to remind everyone present of hierarchy and expectation, but they landed into a space that had already shifted because Ethan moved again, not toward her, not in response to her voice, but across a line only he could see, placing himself exactly where he needed to be before anyone else realized. There was a need at all, and the moment stretched, thin and silent, like the instant before a storm changes direction. And for the first time since she entered the chamber, Lady Vealara felt something unfamiliar settle just beneath her composure. Not fear, not yet, but the quiet awareness that something important was happening without her permission, and she was no longer the one in control of it. No one in the chamber registered the moment the pattern broke because nothing dramatic announced it. No alarms, no flashing warnings, only a subtle misalignment in timing. A fraction of a second where expectation and reality stopped matching, and Ethan Cole stepped fully into that gap, his movement smooth, unhurried, almost casual, yet placed with exact precision between Lady Vealara and the point she still could not see. His body angled just enough to intercept a line that had not yet fully formed in anyone else's awareness. And then it happened, not as an explosion or a strike, but as a quiet disruption. Like a sentence cut off before the final word, the figure near the perimeter faltered, not collapsing, not reacting with visible force, simply stopping, as if something fundamental had been removed from the equation, and a small metallic object slid across the polished floor, spinning once, twice, before settling into stillness 10 feet away, its surface reflecting the chamber. Lights in dull, harmless glints, and only then did the room begin to catch up. Conversations died mid-breath. Heads turned. The projection above flickered again as if confused by the sudden shift in motion below, and the delegates who had been watching Lady Vealara now looked past her, trying to understand what had just occurred without any clear cause to anchor their perception. Vealara herself did not move at first, her posture still poised, her expression composed, but her eyes sharpened, tracking the direction Ethan had taken, the position he now held, the fact that he stood between her and the unknown variable that had just resolved itself without her awareness, and that realization landed quietly, heavier than any spoken warning. "What was that?" she asked, not loudly, not theatrically, but with a precision that demanded an answer. Ethan did not turn to face her. His gaze remained forward, scanning, confirming, recalculating the room as if the event had been only one piece of a larger sequence. His voice calm when he finally spoke, low enough that it did not carry beyond the immediate space between them. "Nothing that will continue," he said. The wording was strange, deliberate, and it sent a subtle ripple through her thoughts, because it implied something had already ended before it could begin. Around them, security personnel began to shift, delayed by the absence of a clear trigger, their systems now scrambling to identify what had already been handled, their attention drawn to the small object on the floor, to the unmoving figure near the wall, to the human who had repositioned himself without permission or instruction. Veolara stepped closer, closing the distance again, this time not as a display of authority, but as a need to understand, her voice lower now, stripped of earlier amusement. You moved before anyone saw anything, she said. Why? Ethan's eyes flicked once toward her, just enough to acknowledge the question, and for the first time she saw something there, not arrogance, not defiance, but a kind of practiced certainty, the look of someone who had lived in environments where hesitation had consequences measured in seconds. Because where I come from, he replied. If you wait to see it, you are already too late. The words settled into the chamber with a weight that did not need volume to be felt, and as Veolara followed his gaze once more, trying again to understand what he had seen before anyone else, she realized something that shifted her perspective in a way no display of power could have done. The human had not acted to prove anything. He had not responded to her. He had not even acknowledged the room. He had simply done what was necessary before anyone else understood that anything was required at all. And for the first time since she had entered the chamber, Lady Veolara did not feel like the most aware person in the room. The chamber did not return to normal because normal required understanding, and no one had that. Yet, the quiet stretched longer than protocol allowed, long enough for discomfort to replace curiosity, long enough for every delegate present to realize that something had just occurred outside their systems, their rules, their expectations, and that realization settled into the room like a pressure change no one could ignore, the kind that made even the most powerful individuals reconsider the assumptions they had carried in with them. Lady Veolara did not step back this time. She remained where she was, close enough to Ethan Cole to hear the subtle rhythm of his breathing, steady, controlled, unaffected by the shift in attention now centered on him. And that steadiness drew her focus more than anything else, because everything else in the chamber had reacted in some way. Systems recalibrating, guards repositioning, whispers forming at the edges of perception. But the human remained exactly as he had been, as if nothing important had happened at all. Her eyes moved past him briefly, to the small object on the floor now being carefully approached by security units, to the figure near the wall who still had not moved, and then back to Ethan, measuring again, recalculating not his physical presence, but his place within the structure of the room, and she realized with a quiet clarity that he did not occupy a position within it. He existed slightly outside of it, like a variable that had not been accounted for in the original design. You said it will not continue, she said, her voice low enough that it did not carry beyond them, no longer for the room, no longer for performance, but for understanding. That means you knew what it was. Ethan did not answer immediately, and in that pause she recognized something new, not reluctance, not hesitation, but selection, as if he was deciding which parts of the truth were necessary and which were not. When he spoke, his tone did not change. I recognized the pattern, he said. The words were simple, but they carried weight because they implied repetition, experience, familiarity with something that should have been rare in a place like this. Veolara's gaze sharpened. That pattern does not exist in this system, she replied, not as a challenge, but as a statement of fact grounded in everything she knew about the controlled environment of the council. It does where I am from, Ethan said. There was no emphasis, no attempt to impress, just a statement placed with the same precision as his earlier movement. And for a moment she considered the hologram still rotating above them. The classification data she had dismissed as exaggeration, the red markers indicating environmental hostility, unpredictability, constant threat. And she felt the connection form between that distant world and the man standing in front of her, not as a concept, but as a lived reality. Around them, the chamber began to reorganize, officials speaking in low tones, systems cross-checking logs, the delayed response of a structure trying to catch up to an event it had not predicted. And through it all, Ethan did not engage, did not offer explanations, did not step forward to claim recognition. He simply remained where he was needed, attention outward, as if the moment was not about what had happened, but about what might still happen next. Veolara watched him in silence, and the absence of reaction from him began to reshape her own. The earlier amusement replaced entirely now by a focused curiosity that bordered on respect, though she did not name it as such. You stood between me and something I did not see, she said after a moment, the words careful, deliberate. Was that your duty or your choice? Ethan's eyes shifted slightly, meeting hers fully for the first time, and there was something there now that she had not seen before, not softness, not warmth, but a clarity that cut through assumption. Out there, he said, those are the same thing. The answer lingered between them, simple and absolute, and as Veolara held his gaze, she understood that whatever hierarchy existed in this room, whatever titles and ranks defined power here, they did not apply to the kind of decision he had just made, and that realization did not diminish her authority, but it did change how she measured his. The chamber settled into a new kind of silence, not the polite quiet of diplomacy, but the measured stillness of minds. Recalculating what they had just witnessed, and Lady Veolara felt it ripple outward from a single point, the human standing less than 6 feet from her, unchanged, unbothered, as if the weight of the room had simply chosen to orbit him without his consent, and that alone shifted something fundamental in how she perceived him. The overhead projection dimmed slightly as the system reallocated processing to security analysis, the once vivid image of the rotating planet fading into a muted glow, and for the first time since the session began, Veolara did not care about the agenda, the treaties, or the observers watching from distant systems. Her focus narrowed to a single variable that did not behave according to any rule she had been taught. Your world, she said quietly, not as a challenge, but as an inquiry. You speak of it as if it shaped you to expect this. Ethan did not look up at the hologram, did not acknowledge the implication, but there was a subtle shift in his stance, a redistribution of weight that suggested memory rather than reaction. It did not teach us to expect it, he said. It taught us to notice it. The distinction was small, but it carried weight, and Veolara felt it settle into her thoughts like a piece of a larger pattern she had not yet fully seen. Around them, officials continued their delayed response, scanning, questioning, attempting to reconstruct an event that had already resolved itself, but their efforts felt distant now, secondary, like echoes of something that had already been decided elsewhere. Veolara's gaze moved again to the floor, to the small object now secured within a containment field, its purpose still unclear, its presence unexplained, and then back to Ethan, and she realized that whatever that object had been, whatever sequence it had initiated, it had never reached completion, not because the system had stopped it, but because he had. You intervened before confirmation, she said, her voice steady but carrying a new layer of precision. Without authorization, without signal. Ethan's response came without hesitation. There was no time for either. The answer was simple, but it cut through layers of protocol that defined how this chamber operated, and Veolara understood the implication immediately, that in his world, permission was a luxury that did not always exist, that action was measured not by approval, but by outcome, and that realization unsettled her not because it contradicted her authority, but because it existed entirely outside of it. She took a slow breath, the controlled air cool against her lungs, and studied him again, not as a subordinate, not as a curiosity, but as something closer to an equal in a different domain of understanding. And if you were wrong, she asked, not accusing, not testing, but genuinely seeking the boundary of his certainty. Ethan's eyes met hers again, steady, unwavering, and for a moment the noise of the chamber faded completely, leaving only that exchange between them. Then I would have adjusted, he said. There was no arrogance in the statement, no attempt to elevate himself, just a quiet confidence built on experience rather than theory, and Veolara felt something shift again, deeper this time, a recognition that his certainty did not come from belief, but from survival. In the distance, a senior official approached, posture rigid, expression controlled, ready to reclaim order, to restore the structure that had briefly fractured. But as he drew closer, his pace slowed, his attention caught by the same stillness that surrounded Ethan, and for a brief moment, even authority hesitated. Veolara noticed that, and it confirmed what she had begun to suspect, that the human did not disrupt the room through force or defiance, but through presence, through a kind of awareness that made others question their own. She straightened slightly, not to reassert dominance, but to realign herself within this new understanding, and when she spoke again, her tone had changed, no longer edged with amusement or irritation, but carrying a quiet respect she did not bother to hide. You are not here to follow, she said. It was not a question. Ethan did not respond immediately, his gaze already shifting past her once more, scanning, measuring, ensuring the room had returned to a stable state, and when he finally spoke, his voice was as calm as it had been from the beginning. I am here to make sure it continues. The words settled into the space between them, simple, unadorned, and Veilira understood then that whatever role had been assigned to him on paper, whatever title had been given, it did not fully describe what he actually was. And as the chamber slowly resumed its motion, its voices rising again, its systems stabilizing, she found herself watching him not with skepticism, but with a growing awareness that the most dangerous presence in the room was also the quietest one, and it had been standing beside her the entire time. The chamber tried to move on, but it did not move the same way anymore. Every voice just slightly more measured, every gesture just slightly more deliberate, as if the space itself had learned something it could not unlearn, and Lady Veilira felt that shift most clearly in the way people now looked at the human standing beside her, not openly, not with challenge, but with that careful attention reserved for variables no one fully understands. The senior official who had approached earlier finally reached them, his posture rigid, his expression composed into the familiar mask of authority, but even he did not immediately speak, his eyes moving briefly to Ethan, then back to Veilira, recalibrating his tone before addressing her. My lady, he began, voice controlled. The situation has been contained. We are reviewing the anomaly. Veilira did not look at him right away. Her gaze remained on Ethan for a moment longer, as if confirming something only she could measure now. Then she shifted her attention, acknowledging the official with a slight inclination of her head. It was already handled, she said. The words were simple, but they carried a subtle weight, a quiet correction that redirected ownership of the moment, and the official hesitated, just briefly, before nodding. Yes, of course. His eyes flicked once more toward Ethan, and this time the hesitation was more visible, not fear, not quite respect, but the recognition that the human had acted outside the expected chain of command, and yet had produced an outcome no one could argue with. We will need a full report, he added, though the certainty in his tone had softened. Ethan did not respond. He did not offer explanation, did not step forward to claim responsibility, and that silence stretched just long enough for the official to realize that whatever report would be written, it would not come from the human himself. Veilira noticed that too, and something about it shifted her understanding further, because in her world, power was often reinforced through declaration, through control of narrative, through visible acknowledgement, but Ethan seemed entirely uninterested in any of that, as if the act itself was complete the moment it was done, requiring no recognition beyond its outcome. The official cleared his throat slightly, adjusting his stance, and turned his attention back to Veilira. We recommend a brief recess while we secure the chamber and verify all participants. It was a reasonable suggestion, standard protocol after any irregularity, but Veilira found herself considering it differently now, weighing not just the procedure, but the implication of stepping away from a space that had just revealed something important. No, she said after a moment, her voice calm but firm. We continue. The decision landed with quiet finality, and the official nodded again, though this time there was a trace of uncertainty beneath his compliance. As you wish, my lady. He stepped back, signaling to the others, and the chamber slowly resumed its formal rhythm, though the undercurrent remained, subtle but undeniable. Veilira turned slightly, positioning herself so that Ethan remained within her peripheral vision, not out of distrust, but out of a new awareness that his presence altered the environment in ways she could not ignore. You changed the pace of this room, she said quietly, not expecting a response, but stating an observation she had come to accept. Ethan's gaze moved briefly toward her, then back across the chamber, scanning, measuring, confirming stability in a way that had nothing to do with politics or protocol. The room was already changing, he replied. I just moved with it. The answer lingered, and Veilira considered it carefully, because it suggested something deeper than reaction, something closer to alignment with forces others did not perceive until it was too late. She followed his line of sight again, this time not searching for a threat, but trying to understand the pattern he had recognized, the subtle shifts he had read before anyone else. And though she could not yet see what he saw, she could feel the edges of it, like a shape just beyond focus. "And now," she asked softly, "is it stable?" Ethan did not answer immediately, and in that pause she sensed that his assessment was ongoing, not fixed, not absolute, but fluid, adapting moment by moment. When he finally spoke, his voice remained even. For now, the words were not reassuring, not intended to be, but they were honest, and Veolara found that she valued that more than any controlled certainty she had heard before. Around them, the chamber continued, voices rising, agreements forming, systems stabilizing, but beneath it all, a new understanding had taken root, one that did not rely on titles or rank, but on perception, on timing, on the ability to act before confirmation. And as Veolara stood there, listening, observing, she realized that the human beside her was not simply part of the room. He was a different kind of constant within it, one that did not demand attention, but quietly redefined it. The rhythm of the chamber returned on the surface, voices rising in measured cadence, agreements forming in layered tones of diplomacy. But beneath that controlled structure something had shifted permanently, and Lady Veolara could feel it in the way attention now flowed differently, no longer anchored solely to rank or authority, but subtly, almost instinctively, circling back to the human who did not participate in any of it. Ethan Cole stood where he had always stood, slightly behind, slightly to the side, positioned with quiet precision, his presence neither intrusive nor withdrawn, simply exact, as if he occupied the only place in the room that mattered and had no need to prove it. Veolara allowed the discussion to continue around her, responding when required, guiding when necessary, but part of her awareness remained fixed on him, studying not his actions, because there were none to observe, but his stillness, the kind that was not passive but active, a constant calculation running beneath the surface. She had seen warriors before, had commanded them, trained them, dismissed them, but this was different. This was not someone prepared for conflict. This was someone shaped by it in a way that made preparation unnecessary. "You said it is stable, for now," she said quietly, her voice threading through the ongoing discussion without disrupting it, directed only to him. "What changes that?" Ethan did not answer immediately, his gaze moving across the chamber, tracing lines no one else followed, measuring distances, timing movements, evaluating patterns that remained invisible to others, and when he spoke, his tone remained even, almost reflective. "Assumptions," he said. The word was simple, but it carried weight, and Veolara felt it land with more force than any formal declaration made in the room. "Explain," she said, not as a command, but as a request she intended to understand. Ethan's eyes shifted briefly toward her, acknowledging the question, then returned to the room. "People assume systems will catch what they miss," he said. "They assume threats will announce themselves. They assume someone else is watching." Each sentence was measured, deliberate, and Veolara felt each one settle into place, forming a structure that challenged the foundation of everything this chamber relied on. "And where you are from?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "Those assumptions do not exist." Ethan's response came without pause. "They exist," he said. "They just do not last." The distinction was sharp, and it cut deeper than she expected, because it implied that belief alone was not enough to sustain safety, that reality would eventually correct any false certainty, and that on his world, that correction came quickly. Veolara looked out over the chamber again, this time not as a ruler assessing her domain, but as someone reevaluating the reliability of the structure itself, the protocols, the systems, the carefully balanced order that had always seemed absolute. And for the first time she saw its edges, the places where it depended on consistency that might not always hold. A subtle movement near the upper tier caught her attention, not because it was obvious, but because Ethan's posture adjusted by less than an inch in response, a signal she was beginning to recognize, and her gaze followed his, focusing on the same distant point. There was nothing overt, nothing that would trigger alarm, just a slight delay in motion, a figure hesitating where others flowed smoothly, a pattern not quite aligned, and Veolara felt a quiet tension build, not from fear, but from anticipation, because she now understood that this was how it began, not with noise, not with spectacle, but with something small enough to be ignored. "You see something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan did not confirm it directly, but his stance shifted again, placing himself along a new line she could not yet fully perceive, and that was answer enough. The chamber continued its discussions, unaware, the illusion of control intact, but Violera no longer trusted that illusion completely, not after what she had already witnessed. If it happens again, she asked softly, will you act the same way? Ethan's eyes moved once, meeting hers with that same steady clarity. If it is the right move, he said. There was no promise in the answer, no guarantee, only a commitment to decision over hesitation, and Violera realized that this was what made him different, not his strength, not his origin, but his refusal to wait for certainty before acting. And as she turned her attention back to the chamber, her awareness sharpened, her perception adjusting. She found herself watching the room the way he did, not for what was obvious, but for what did not quite fit. And in that quiet shift, she began to understand a truth she had never needed before, that power was not just the ability to command, but the ability to see. And in that moment, she was only beginning to learn how. The shift did not announce itself, it never did. And that was why most of the chamber missed it entirely. The discussion continuing in smooth, practiced rhythms, voices layered in calm authority, data streams updating across translucent displays. Everything appearing stable, controlled, predictable. But Lady Violera no longer trusted appearances, not after learning how easily something critical could exist just beneath them without recognition. She followed the subtle change in Ethan Cole's posture again, the nearly invisible adjustment that had become her only reliable signal. And this time, she did not wait for confirmation. She traced the line of his attention before the rest of the room even realized there was something to see. High above, along the upper-tier walkway, a figure paused half a second too long before moving again. The delay so small it would vanish inside any normal sequence, but it did not vanish to her now, not after she had learned what to look for, and the realization came quietly, not as panic, but as clarity. The pattern was repeating, not identical, but similar enough to matter. There, she said softly, the word directed only to him. But this time it was not a question, it was recognition. Ethan did not look at her, but there was a brief stillness in his breathing that confirmed she had seen it. And for the first time since the chamber began, they were aligned in perception, not authority, not role, but awareness. The figure continued forward, blending back into motion, and nothing outwardly disrupted the room. No alarms, no signals, just the quiet continuation of business as usual. And yet Violera felt the tension building in a way she had not before, not because she feared what might happen, but because she understood how easily it could. You will not wait, she said, her voice low, steady, not asking but acknowledging the pattern she had come to understand. Ethan shifted slightly, positioning himself again along that invisible line. And when he spoke, his tone carried the same calm certainty it always had. Waiting is how you lose the advantage. The words settled into her thoughts, and she realized something that changed her role in that moment. She did not need to command him. She needed to trust the decision he would make before she could even see the reason for it. Around them, the chamber remained unaware, the illusion intact, but Violera no longer stood fully within that illusion. She stood at its edge, watching the same unseen currents he did. And for the first time, she adjusted her own stance, not to display authority, but to align with his position, a subtle shift that placed her just slightly behind his line instead of in front of it. It was a small change, one no one else would notice, but to Ethan, it mattered, because it removed an obstacle, cleared a path, acknowledged without words that she understood her place in the sequence he was about to execute. The figure above reached a point directly aligned with their position, and for a fraction of a second, the pattern broke again. A movement too precise to be natural, too controlled to be random, and Ethan moved, not fast, not dramatic, just exact, a single step that altered the geometry of the moment, and whatever had been about to happen simply did not. The figure above faltered, not collapsing, not reacting outwardly, just losing alignment with whatever unseen timing it had carried, and then continuing forward as if nothing had occurred at all. No one in the chamber noticed. No one paused. No one questioned. The discussion continued, seamless, uninterrupted, the illusion of control perfectly preserved. Violera exhaled slowly, only then realizing she had been holding her breath, and her gaze lifted briefly to the upper tier, watching the figure disappear into the flow of movement, leaving no trace, no evidence, nothing that could be pointed to as a threat. She turned back to Ethan, studying him with a depth of understanding that had not existed before. "It is gone," she said quietly. Ethan did not confirm it immediately, his gaze still moving, still verifying, ensuring the pattern had fully resolved, and when he finally spoke, his voice remained calm. It was never allowed to finish. The distinction mattered, and Veilira understood it now, that he did not react to threats. He prevented them from ever becoming real, and as the chamber carried on around them, unaware of how close it had come to disruption for a second time, she realized that the human beside her was not simply guarding her position, he was guarding the reality that allowed this room to believe it was always in control. The chamber never realized how close it had come to breaking, and that was the most dangerous part. Not the anomaly itself, not the unseen patterns moving through its carefully controlled space, but the illusion that nothing had ever been wrong, that everything had unfolded exactly as intended, and Lady Veilira stood at the center of that illusion, feeling its weight differently now, no longer comforted by it, but aware of the thin line that held it together. The session continued, agreements finalized, voices steady, the projection above returning to full brightness as if to reaffirm stability, but Veilira's attention no longer followed the formal structure of the meeting. It remained anchored to the one presence that had quietly rewritten her understanding of what stability actually meant. Ethan Cole had returned to stillness again, exactly as before, hands behind his back, posture relaxed, expression unreadable, as if the last several minutes had not occurred at all, as if he had not just altered the outcome of events no one else had even perceived, and that absence of acknowledgement struck her more deeply than any display of power could have. "You let them believe it was nothing," she said quietly, her voice low enough that it dissolved into the ambient sound of the chamber. Ethan did not immediately respond, his gaze moving once more across the room, confirming what only he could measure, and when he spoke, his tone remained calm, unchanged. "It is easier for them that way." The answer settled into her thoughts, and she understood the implication. That awareness carried responsibility, that seeing what he saw would force them to change how they operated, how they trusted, how they assumed safety existed, and most of them were not prepared for that shift. Veilira looked out over the chamber again, this time not with authority, but with a quiet detachment, observing the delegates as they continued their work, unaware of how much they depended on variables they could not perceive. "And for you," she asked softly, "is it easier not to tell them?" Ethan's eyes shifted toward her briefly, and there was something in that glance, not emotion, not quite, but recognition, as if he understood the question beneath the words. "No," he said, "just necessary." The distinction mattered, and Veilira felt it settle into place, completing the pattern she had been trying to understand since the moment he first moved, that his actions were not about preference, not about recognition, but about outcome, about maintaining a reality that others could safely exist within, even if they never knew how close it had come to changing. The final statements of the session were delivered, formal, precise, the kind that would be recorded, archived, studied, but Veilira found herself listening differently now, measuring not the words themselves, but the silence between them, the spaces where something unseen could exist, where a pattern could begin, where someone like Ethan would already be watching. As the chamber began to disperse, delegates rising, conversations shifting into quieter tones, the controlled structure dissolving into motion, Veilira remained where she was for a moment longer, watching the human beside her, considering everything she had learned without being told. "Where you are from," she said finally, her voice steady, thoughtful. "People like you, are they common?" Ethan's answer came without hesitation. "No," he paused briefly, as if selecting the next word with care. "But the world makes sure there are enough." Veilira absorbed that, the implication of a place that demanded awareness, that shaped individuals to see what others missed, and she realized that what stood beside her was not an exception to his world, but a product of it, refined by conditions she could only begin to imagine. She turned slightly, preparing to leave, the session complete, the formalities concluded, but she stopped for just a moment, looking back at him with a new clarity, not as a subordinate, not as a curiosity, but as something far more precise. You were not assigned to protect me, she said, the words quiet, certain. Ethan did not correct her, did not confirm it directly, but his gaze met hers one last time, steady, unwavering. I was assigned to make sure this room stays intact. The difference was subtle, but absolute, and Lyra understood it completely now, that he did not guard individuals, he guarded outcomes. He did not respond to threats, he prevented them from existing at all. And as she stepped away, merging back into the flow of her world, she carried that understanding with her, a quiet shift that would change how she saw everything that followed. Behind her, Ethan Cole remained where he had always been, unnoticed by most, unrecognized by many, standing in the space between what was seen and what was prevented. And if anyone had asked what made him dangerous, they would not have found the answer in his strength or his speed, but in something far simpler, far quieter. He never waited for the moment to happen. He ended it before it began.